I'm not going to introduce either of these speakers to you. That would be too simple. I think what I would like to do is perhaps introduce the Enlightenment, which might be a little more difficult considering it is a historical or a series of historical events, writings that stretches, several centuries and has been discussed for several centuries after that. Now, I just wanted to give you a short grid of some of the key oppositions that we have come to associate with Enlightenment thinking. And if I can find that here, I've reduced them to a set of oppositions. And many of them will be quite familiar to you. One is, of course, the opposition of reason and faith. Reason is typically associated with the thought of the Enlightenment. It's called the Age of Reason for good reason. But reason itself doesn't emerge with the Enlightenment. I think reason emerges at the very dawn of Western philosophy in perhaps the first line of what perhaps is a book by Heraclitus. The first word, in fact, is the Logos, which holds forever. And this Logos is sometimes also translated as reason. It is the ancestor of words like logic, and you encounter it in many other fields today. So reason really inaugurates the dawn of a certain kind of thought. And this, in the Enlightenment, however, comes to be contrasted with faith. Then you have science contrasted with religion, autonomy contrasted with authority, equality with hierarchy, freedom with nature, universality, a key term for Enlightenment thought, with relativism. Man, of course, is contrasted with God. Skepticism is contrasted with tradition, progress with the status quo, and finally democracy with monarchy, aristocracy. I mean, after all, there were 3 revolutions that swept that period that is called the Enlightenment, ending with the French Revolution. So having given you this brief grid, I'm sure this will help us appreciate better what Professor Grayling is going to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, yes. May I just start by saying that, of course, one of the great values that the Enlightenment proposes to us is free speech. And it is a tremendously important human right and civil liberty at the same time. The idea that we have other rights can only be asserted and defended if we have free speech. We can't claim our other rights. We can't defend ourselves against calumny or oppression. We can't debate and discuss in education or in the political process unless we have free speech. And therefore, it's tremendously important to remember that what people say and the views that they express and the outlook that they wish to propose for other people to consider and debate should be a matter that belongs to everybody. Nobody should have the right to say, because I believe something, you aren't allowed to say or do something. And we know that at this festival, the free speech issue has been very prominent. So I just begin my remarks by saying that I'm sorry that Salman isn't here, and that we should all applaud the concept of free speech again. Well, there is the Enlightenment, which is an 18th century, primarily an 18th century historical phenomenon. And then there is what sometimes gets called the Enlightenment project, which is the descendant and dispersion through debate and creation of institutions, which comes out of the great achievement of the 18th century Enlightenment. And of course, people who were great movers of the 18th century Enlightenment sometimes articulated things and thought about things in ways which what's happened since during the course of history has had to be somewhat modified. And just to give you one example, many of the great figures of the Enlightenment in the 18th century were deists. That's to say, they were people who didn't have an understanding either of physics or of biology which would help them to understand how things had originated, how the world had got started and how life had got started. So they thought, well, there must be some sort of an agency that got things going, but they weren't otherwise interested in organized religion, or they didn't think that the fact that there might have been such an agency should make a very big difference to their lives. Nowadays, they would probably be called atheists. So in the tradition of thought that stems from the Enlightenment, you see an evolution or a progression of the way some of these ideas worked. But many of the ideas are the same, and they've been very well summarized. I suppose the one big thing which distinguishes the Enlightenment is that it opposed the idea that there is one great truth that everybody must accept, one right way to live, one orthodoxy. Everybody has got to get in line and toe that line and accept the authority of the absolute monarch and the arbiters of that ideology. Most of humankind, for most of history, had lived under this idea that there is a one-size-fits-all, top-down ideology that everybody has to subscribe to. They mustn't think for themselves, they must accept. They mustn't act autonomously, they must submit. And the Enlightenment taught people, put the argument to people, that there is a great plurality and diversity of human talent for good and interesting and productive lives, and that people have a responsibility to themselves and to one another to work within a space of autonomy. Plurality and diversity were recognized. The idea that people owned themselves and weren't the property of an absolute monarch, for example. The idea that people could inquire, research, think, find out for themselves, and not just have to accept the handed-down authority from some body, some institution which claimed to know what all the answers were. That's the real gift of enlightenment, and that's the thing which is worth protecting and advancing now. And actually, the result of those endeavors in the 18th century bore immediate fruit. The American Revolution and the French Revolution, the spread of ideas of democracy and personal autonomy, the idea of rights that individual people, just in virtue of being human, have a claim on the attention of others and a right to expect to be allowed to live choices. Those are the great immediate gifts of the Enlightenment project. And they reshaped the world, the world that we sometimes think of, the sort of European world, and the world that spread out of that. And of course, there have been many efforts in many great civilizations beforehand which had approximated some of these things. It is indeed the case that the ideal of reason, of a rational life, a thoughtful, investigative life, was fully present in ancient times. And the idea of the independence of a body of people, the polis in ancient Greece, for example, was fully developed then. But of course, it had been lost, and in the tidal flow of historical events had been submerged and then re-emerged. But it was the 18th century Enlightenment which saw the major re-emergence, and we are all the beneficiaries of it in many ways. So I'm a great champion of the Enlightenment, and I think the project that's embodied in Enlightenment ideals is one which is worth fighting for, because at the same moment that the Enlightenment took rise, so the counter-Enlightenment took rise. And all the way through the centuries since the 18th century, we've seen endeavors by different counter-Enlightenment movements to try to contest and, if possible, to defeat those ideals that arose out of the Enlightenment. And two are of great significance. One, of course, is the battle that religious organizations, that, for example, in Europe, the church and the churches raised against the autonomy and as they sought faithlessness of human individuals. But the other was Romanticism. And Romanticism, although it's something that we wouldn't gladly be without the music and the poetry of the Romantic movement, we might very well dispense with some of the darker sides of Romanticism. The idea, for example, that it is not reason that has command over the best parts of ourselves, where we have to make the most careful and considered choices about how we, for example, deal with other people or construct good societies. But it's our race or our blood or our inheritance or ancient times or those irrational things that, the impulses that drive people to do things. Romanticism gave rise to racist ideas, gave rise to nationalism, gave rise ultimately to fascism. Fascism is a kind of romantic politics in a way. And in both the two major counter-Enlightenment drives, you see the desire on the part of some people to maintain the idea that an overarching single ideology must master and control and direct the great masses of human beings. And that was, of course, directly contrary to the idea of the independence and autonomy of each individual person. So you can see the Enlightenment as that moment when the individual, when people stood up in their own right to lay claim to the possibility of good, flourishing, diverse human lives against all those institutions and forces that wanted to corral them into a kind of uniformity that repressed thought and development. And I end on the thought, and you mentioned science and reason. What happened in the 18th century, what's so interesting about it is that the great advances that had been made in the natural sciences in the 16th and 17th centuries were so powerful, so persuasive to anybody of reason, anybody who saw that they understood the methodology and saw the results of it, that the philosophers of the 18th century in France, for example, the editors of the great encyclopedia, wanted to try to apply those methods, those ideas, those kinds of inquiries to life in general, to society, to morality. I mean, the emergence of sociology and politics as serious pursuits for thought were extensions of the scientific method into human affairs generally. And that's a very characteristic thing about the Enlightenment, and it's never stopped. Where we are today, the great wonders of delayed airline
for diversity, that not all humans will have the same tastes and the same preferences. And indeed, the enormous amount of variation between individuals does swamp to our eyes. So the difference between an average Swede and an average other Swede is bigger than the average difference between, say, all Africans and all Europeans. Even though it's probably an exaggeration to say, as is often popular, that race is entirely a social construct, it has no biological reality, it probably has some reality as a statistical concept. Nonetheless, it's quite a minor source of variation compared to the differences from one individual to another. I'd like to add a few comments to Anthony's brilliant exposition of the core of the Enlightenment, and add them from my perspective. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a historian of ideas, I'm a cognitive psychologist, but how the ideas of the Enlightenment became indispensable to my way of thinking. For one thing, I think historically, what little I do know about the Enlightenment suggests that it does owe some debt of thanks to my own field, psychology, in particular the study of perception, that some of the earliest thinkers of the Age of Reason started from the basic observation that all humans are fallible, that no matter how certain we feel we are subjectively, we know that there are flaws in the way our own brains work that mean that we're always vulnerable to illusion and error. And some of the earliest thinkers in the Age of Reason, like Erasmus of Rotterdam, made a lot out of visual illusions, the kind of displays that you might be familiar with from straight, or even a tower in the distance that is rectangular, but it looks like it's cylindrical. And Erasmus called attention to all of these phenomena from introductory psychology to make the point that even the way of knowing that we might think of as most infallible, I saw it with my own eyes, what could be than that we can be mistaken. And the possibility that we can be mistaken, the idea of skepticism, might be, Anthony might disagree, but or might agree, that the cornerstone of the Enlightenment. Because as soon as you realize that every one of us is fallible, you demand reasons for belief. The fact that your priest or the Pope or the mullah or the Ayatollah tells you something is true is no guarantee that it's true. The fact that I feel in my bones that something is true is no guarantee that it's true. The only way to approach the truth is to recognize that every one of us is fallible. That is also, I think, the cornerstone of free speech. That even if something that someone says strikes me as wrong, as insulting, as hurtful, as blasphemous, as heretical, as dangerous, the fact is that he's a human being and I'm a human being. And nothing would justify me in saying that my conviction that there's something wrong with what he says can justify my shutting up that person. So the fundamental foundation of psychology, namely the brain is a system that is prone to error, I think underlies our commitment to many of the foundational beliefs of the Enlightenment. Now, often people will suspect that there is some contradiction between the avowed goal of science, which is to discover a truth that is true for everyone for all time, and the idea that everyone by right is entitled to his or her own beliefs. Is science just a new form of authority and dogma, just another religion, as it is claimed? I think it's a recognition of the fallibility of the individual that makes that allows one to say that no, science is not just another source of authority and dogma. What I see as the central assumption behind scientific pursuit is that there is a truth, but none of us knows it. We can collectively do our best to find out what it is, but no particular individual, by virtue of authority, reputation, status, prestige, power, has any privileged access to the truth. Everyone is responsible for providing reasons for why what they believe ought to be agreed upon by everyone else. The final observation that I'll make about why a psychologist would end up so interested in the Enlightenment comes from my interest in the psychology and the history of violence, and why, as I mentioned earlier in the day, by many measures, violence has historically been in decline. And as a social scientist, I tend to look at input variables like prosperity and inequality and industrialization and literacy, and output variables, in this case a decline in violence, and try to see whether one of the inputs predicts one of the outputs. But as I started to explore why, for example, slavery, after millennia of being accepted all over the world, suddenly was abolished in country after country, why mutilation and torture as forms of routine punishment were suddenly abolished in a very narrow slice of time centered in the second half of the 18th century, why gruesome sadistic sports like bear baiting were abolished, why the change in child-rearing practices away from physical punishment and beating and toward trying to understand the world from the child's point of view. Why all of these reforms and many, many others were concentrated in this narrow slice of history, I realized it was because of arguments that were made at the time. It wasn't because of changes in the material circumstance. It was because thinkers, philosophers, we would call them today, wrote briefs arguing why some practice was indefensible. The pamphlet or the book would go viral. It would be translated into a dozen other languages. They would become instant bestsellers. They would be debated in coffee houses and salons and pubs, and then would find their way into legislatures and in actual enforceable laws with actual teeth that ended a barbaric practice or otherwise advanced the overall welfare of society. So social scientists tend not to take ideas and arguments as forces with causal power, but I came to realize that in all of these reforms, that collectively have been called power that caused people to be measurably better off.
Yes, I'm going to ask you a question.
May I comment on something that Steve said there? In the immortal words of a former pupil of mine at Oxford, Steve has put his foot on something important there, which is absolutely right, that doubt and certainty are the two poles around which or if you like, the flint and the stone which struck the spark of the Enlightenment. Because prior to the Enlightenment, prior and down to the whole period of the scientific revolution and Enlightenment, doubt was a sin. To doubt was to be a heretic, was to call in question something that was regarded as received and orthodox, and which was put in danger if people doubted it. But it was the admission of doubt, the admission of fallibility, which is so distinctive of the whole enterprise of Enlightenment. You all, of course, remember Descartes. You were all reading him in the bath last night. You remember he said, "I drink, therefore I am," and so on. All that started from saying, in order to see whether there is anything that can be known, we've got to doubt as deeply and systematically as we can. We must call in question everything that admits of the very least taint, the very least possibility of doubt. And from that begins this enterprise of trying to recover some understanding of the world and how we get to know about the world. And the result is a very significant one. There's a great contrast between a mindset, a way of looking at things, which has a beginning, a middle, and end, closure. It's very neat. It explains everything. You know all the answers, and you may get into trouble if you call those answers into question. That's one mindset. The other mindset is we don't know a great deal. We're very excited about the business of trying to find out. We inquire, and the more we learn, the more we find out that we don't know, the more inquiries there are. Open-ended, living with uncertainty, living with doubt, living with inquiry, and accepting that as being a very rich, very exciting prospect. And that's the scientific mindset, of course.
Well, thank you. My question was a little tangential to this, but I'll ask it anyway. You were here last year, and perhaps some of you were. I was here as well. And just before you spoke, the South African novelist Coetzee read a beautiful story. And I meant, after hearing that, to ask you this question, because it was very relevant to what you were saying about philosophy then, but I can ask it now. He had read, in case any of you were here, you would remember, he read a story about a son going to meet his mother in Spain. And this mother is living with a large number of cats, and with a middle-aged peasant, handicapped lover, and the son is very unhappy about this. In any case, the story is a great contrast between this very proper, rational son and this very intuitive, emotional mother. Now, one of the contrasts that we get, not only between reason and emotion, but between philosophy and literature, is just this contrast between rationality on the one hand and emotions on the other. How do you think post-Enlightenment and post-Romanticism, this kind of opposition has been bridged, and has it been bridged?
Well, it's a very interesting one, this, because of course, and for a very good reason, it always comes up, that the apparent contrast between these things. And it's very odd, when you talk to people who are great believers in the importance of reason, great believers in the importance of individuality, people immediately confront them by saying, but surely our emotional lives, what, if we could use the word in a sort of secular sense, our spiritual lives, surely that's the most important part of our experience. And in the case of individualism, surely our communities, our families, our social connections are tremendously important to us. And doesn't individualism lead to what some people think of as the sort of disbenefits of what we see in society today? And the response to it is to say that when people assert the significance of the individual and the rights of the individual, they don't mean to separate the individual from those deep social connections which are of the very essence of being human. Human beings are a social species. We need one another. Our relationships are the most important thing that we have. The same is true of reason. When we say that people should sign up for the project of reason, be rational, ratio, put a relationship of proportion between the evidence you have something and the belief that you base on it. When you're building aeroplanes, running a country's economy, putting yourself under the surgeon's knife, you hope that reason is in the driving seat in all those cases, and you want the processes that have resulted them to have been rational processes. But that doesn't mean that you deny the fantastic importance of the emotional life. And in fact, there are some people, I don't know whether Steve agrees with what Antonio Damasio, for example, has to say about the place of emotion in reasoning. His argument being that you are a worse reasoner if you don't have some emotional commitment to things that you reason, providing, of course, that the emotions in question are tutored, educated, mature ones, not if they're irrational or chaotic ones. The point that he makes is that Mr. Spock in Star Trek, the guy with the ears, that he would actually be a very poor logician because he is allegedly unemotional. Of course, he's always weeping and falling in love, we remember. The suspicion is that he's in love with Captain Kirk. But the idea is, it was a real kind of Mr. Spock character. He would be lousy at logic because he has no, there's nothing in his premises which sort of directs his reasoning. So, it's just taken for granted that our emotions, that our connections, our sociality as a species are the backdrop against which we urge both the rights and entitlements of the individual and the place of reason in a good life.
But located in different parts of the brain.
Yes. Let me add something about the fear of individualism, because I think that one of the gifts of the Enlightenment has been a promotion of the individual over the tribe, the religion, the class, the race, as the entity whose flourishing we ought to care about. It often raises suspicion when people hear that you'd have to be committed to an extreme anarchist or libertarian viewpoint in which only where individuals have the right to do whatever they please, and any concession to the larger group is an infringement on freedom. And again, I think this is another misconception about what the lessons of the Enlightenment are. For one thing, as Anthony mentioned, the fact that among human desires, among the conditions for human flourishing, are being a part of a community. So even a respect for the flourishing of the individual realizes that one of the things that individuals appreciate is to be part of family and community. So family and community are valuable insofar as they are something that allows individuals to flourish. But also there are many situations in which it's only by some regulation of the group that individuals can best flourish. So to give a very concrete analogy, in a sport like ice hockey, I come from Canada, so I tend to draw my analogies from hockey. You can certainly skate better and see better if you don't wear a helmet. And if, on the other hand, you're more likely to sustain brain damage if you're checked into the boards and you hit your head against the glass or against the ice or against another player's skate. So if you had a completely libertarian sport of hockey, no one would wear helmets, even if they wanted to protect their brain, because all the other players who were not wearing helmets would be at an advantage, and they would lose the puck, they would make errors, and so on. If you impose from the top down a rule that everyone has to wear a helmet, then everyone is better off than if they had complete freedom of whether or not to wear one. And so that's an example where the flourishing of individuals can be enhanced by some collectively agreed upon regulation on everyone's freedom. And many of the laws in a democracy have that character. They're restrictions that people voluntarily impose on themselves if everyone else is willing to do so at the same time. Those tend to, can enhance human welfare, even if their ultimate benefit is to the individual.
Should we open this up?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Questions? Are there mics? Richard? Right in front.
Hello, Richard.
Hello, Anthony. Is this working? I just wanted to ask, did Uncle Thomas Cabin do more or less than philosophers towards the abolition of slavery?
What was the first part of the sentence? Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Did Uncle Thomas Cabin do more or less than philosophers towards the abolition of slavery? I ask with reluctance because I'm a philosopher.
Yeah.
But my answer to that is to say that Harriet Beecher Stowe was influenced by a debate which had been growing in strength and by a movement which had come out of those ideas. And she dramatized them in a way which disseminated those ideas much more widely. I think that the way that ideas get into public consciousness and into the public conversation very often turns on popular media, like novels and television and theatre and so on. And that's quite right. It's very appropriate. It should be so. But if one traces the ancestry of these outcomes, it very often happens that there are a few individuals who finally say, this isn't acceptable, and they make an argument, they make a case, they persuade other people, and it burgeons from there. So I think that she and the philosophers can jointly claim a medal.
There's a young girl here.
Yes.
People in front have a disadvantage, and everybody is sure. Can you move one of the mics to the back?
I'm a writer and a yoga teacher, and I have a question for each of you, actually. Professor Grayling, I'm a little concerned about how you've sort of not really addressed the fact that the Enlightenment movement was much before the 18th century here in India. In India, we have a very, very long-lasting and large tradition of questioning. In fact, in the 14th century BC, there was a Sanskrit text called Sangraha, Sarva Sangraha, which essentially talks about all religions, and its very first chapter talks about atheism and talks about very powerful, positive reasons for atheism, why people should embrace atheism. I'm a little concerned.
Ask the question.
I'm a little concerned that you did not address that. And to you, Professor Pinker, my question is this. You talked about individualism, about the identity of an individual. My question essentially is that do you think the kind of violence that atheists tend to face, in the West at least, has a lot to do with the fact that individuals tend to identify themselves with their religion? I mean, you take Christianity away from them, you take Islam away from them, they don't know what to do. They have a sense of identity crisis. They don't know what to relate themselves with and how to interact with the world. So do you suppose that is one reason why reason is subverted?
Should we take 2 or 3 questions? So that,
No, I think we should answer one at a
time.
time.
Yeah, I think it's easier, actually.
Yes, yes, I think I agree in that Enlightenment ideas. If the Enlightenment was purely a historical phenomenon, that there were just for some reason some brilliant people in 18th century Europe who came up with these ideas, one would have to wonder whether they really have the universal warrant that they claim. And these ideas ought to be available to any community of thinkers that thinks deeply enough and thoroughly enough and that can challenge each other. And there are, as you say, similar ideas that emerged from India centuries earlier. Amartya Sen has written a wonderful essay on humanitarian and Enlightenment ideas. It's an interesting question, though, to what extent they had an effect in changing the social practices of the day. That an interesting thing about the European Enlightenment is that it started a cascade of concrete reforms, like abolition of slavery, which then spread throughout the world, or the abolition of torture as a form of punishment, or a reduction in the number of capital crimes from the hundreds to just murder. And I didn't see, I'm quite ignorant of the history of ideas within the Indian tradition. I rely mainly on Amartya Sen. But it wasn't clear from his essay how many of these ideas actually changed the practices in the society as opposed to having been raised. But I'm going to admit my ignorance of that. Your second question is to whether people can live without religion, whether it's just so much a part of their identity that life would lose all meaning. I think we're seeing some of that experiment taking place in Western Europe, where in many countries a majority of people claim to not believe in God, have no particular religious affiliation. They might go to church on Christmas Eve because the music is very pleasant, but otherwise they stay away from church. The question is, are they all losing all sense of meaning and value and purpose? Are they just all going to commit mass suicide because life or for that matter become amoral hedonists? And I think the answer is no. That there are, for one thing, there are moral purposes that needn't be religious purposes, such as the reduction of oppression and suffering and war and hunger and disease, that give life a lot of meaning and purpose, even if they don't come from scripture or from a deity or from tradition. And of course, being a human gives you all kinds of pleasure, both physical and spiritual, that one can pursue as long as they don't infringe on the freedom of other people to pursue those pleasures.
So may I just say very quickly in response to your question, it was a combination of brevity and where I'm least ignorant, really, that made me concentrate much more on the European Enlightenment. Now, despite the fact that this is a literary festival, you wouldn't expect any author to talk about his own books, but I will just mention one to you privately, which is that I wrote a book some years ago called What is Good. It's not it's not sort of gone with the wind kind of title, but in it, the European Enlightenment of the 18th century is, I describe as the third Enlightenment. And in fact, the first of them I ascribe to classical antiquity in the European tradition. And it is a fairly well understood fact that there were important intellectual interchanges between the Eastern Mediterranean world and Indian thought. And we know that atheist traditions of philosophy in India are much, much older than the 14th century. They go right back into the sort of BC period. So, yes, I take your point absolutely, and I thank you for it.
Yeah, many practitioners of various philosophies, based on experience, they say there's diversity, there's plurality, but there's an underlying common ground, some kind of a oneness, like we are all humans, but we all think differently, our psychologies are different. So shouldn't the question be reframed from science versus religion or faith versus reason, as they are not contradictory, but they are all asking the same question from different perspectives, but rather the argument is about inquiry versus fundamentalism. That is what I think or believe to be right, and you are wrong, you know. So I think if the question is could you comment on that, please?
I mean, I do think the fact that some apparent contrasts are not really contrasts, but there is an underlying commonality between them, doesn't entail that all apparent contrasts are not real contrasts. So, for example, the idea of the significance of the individual as a focus of rights and possibilities is not inconsistent with the idea of a universal human nature, I mean, that's rather a tendentious or contentious concept, but the idea that there are many things that human beings of any time, any ethnicity, any cultural background share in common with one another, that makes it possible for us to think in terms, for example, of regimes of human rights like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights as applying to everybody everywhere. But still, there are things about the great diversity of human needs and interests and desires which should be respected, because there are so many different talents for making good lives. But the fact that that apparent contrast between the individual and the social really isn't a true contrast doesn't mean that there isn't a true contrast between, for example, the scientific mindset and the religious mindset. There, I think, that there are very sharp contrasts, and those efforts to say they deal with different realms of interest, that they are different magisteria, as the phrase is sometimes used, that they're complementary. I don't think that those hold up, because when you look at it, actual claims are being made about the nature and origin of the world and its destiny and the moral significance for human beings of certain supposed realities, which are absolutely in competition with one another. And so it's important not to lose sight of the fact that there are some real contrasts which we do need to resolve.
Can you keep your questions short, because then we can have many more questions. I think there's that girl sitting there. And then we'll take one at the back.
Professor Pinker, you mentioned that violence has decreased after Enlightenment, but when we talk about violence against nature, it's increased. We are seeing unprecedented amounts of pollution and desecration of nature. So maybe the violence has shifted from being inflicted from one person to another to like being inflicted on nature. What are your thoughts?
Yes, well, I would distinguish between violence that harms a sentient being and violence that harms inanimate objects or plants that don't have consciousness, that don't suffer, that don't feel pain, that don't flourish in the sense of experiencing anything. And so while, of course, pollution and despoliation of the environment are regrettable for many reasons, I don't think morally they're the same as killing, raping, or injuring a living human who can, or animal for that matter, who can experience the harm in the form of subjective suffering. So I don't think they're equivalent, even if there is more damaging of the ecosystem and less harming of humans. And I think the harming of the ecosystem is something that is itself being reduced as we become affluent enough to set the protection of the environment as being among our goals, because a healthy ecosystem is necessary for human flourishing. And of course you have nowadays more of a green consciousness than probably any time in history. So I think that's going to catch up with the other forms of enhancement of human flourishing.
That gentleman there. Short question.
See, in my opinion, a lot of academia suffers from boxing of science. There is hardly any promotion of interdisciplinary studies. For example, now you have economists studying just classical and modern economics without really studying the psychological part of it, not gleaning too much information into behavioral finance and the human psychology. So how can we change that, especially with regards to psychology, in public policy, in economics, and social studies?
So if your question was, I'm going to defer to Steve on this one, because he'll speak much more to the way that neuroscience has influenced psychology and so on. But if I understand your question rightly, you're saying there isn't sufficient interdisciplinary work. It seems to me, I mean, speaking from within the academy, so to speak, there's a huge amount of interdisciplinary work, that in fact all the pigeonholes into which different pursuits have been put are really breaking down. That's a mixed metaphor. But, you know, the disciplines really are feeding into one another in a tremendous way. And we seem, to me at any rate, to be on the verge of a whole new range of understandings that come from the marriage between different approaches. Would you agree, Steve?
Yes, not as much as there should be, and part of the problem is the institutional organization of the university into departments, which means that every department has to hire someone who they can justify as teaching the methods of their discipline as it's always been taught in the past. So it's possible that Department of Economics, Department of Psychology, Department of Sociology, that organization is impeding a trend that is most welcome, that has begun to take place, and that I hope will take place further.
So having got a chair, I'm in no hurry to move.
There's a question to both of you. Would you say that reason is the singular properties exclusive to only enlightened societies? Or would you say that there are many variations of reason and that they exist across a bunch of different societies?
Well, I think reason, which may not be an exclusively human possession, is nevertheless a very widespread human capacity, the capacity for reason. Maybe one of the things which is distinctive of human beings, together with our lack of feathers, you know, if you're looking for a definition. But one has to remember that there can be bad reasoning, or misuses of reason, misapplications of it. There can be very, very rigorous applications of reason from the wrong premises. That may happen very often. It's notable among certain kinds of psychopaths that they are ferociously logical, having started from very, very weird places and getting to even weirder conclusions. And of course, there's theology.
I'd like to, in fact, ask you a question, because I think the answer that you give will be useful in terms of this Enlightenment debate. You know, there has been a contrast between mind as somehow being constituted of human beings, which was part of the legacy of the Enlightenment. And I think one of the things that I learned most from your book was that, in fact, the human mind is even more complex than say, Africa and India combined. You know, it's a very complex, organ. And therefore, there is no simple unitary idea that emerges from it, like reason or rationality, you know. So could you say something about the way in which the diverse way in which the mind functions
Yes.
leads to this?
I think a crucial discovery of my field, modern cognitive science, is that the notice of the flaws of perception that initiated the Age of Reason, when Erasmus pointed to visual illusions, has now been supplemented by realization that there are cognitive illusions. Not ways in which our eyes fool us, but ways in which our minds fool us, in which the human mind, left to its own devices, will make systematic errors in the judgment of probability, in logical inferences. I have to believe that there is a logic that exists independently of human or any minds, that our mind couldn't have come to the conclusion that 2 + 2 = 5, or that A and not A can be true simultaneously just because of the nature of reality. And it may be that a single brain, since it was designed not primarily for logical truth or logical consistency, but for survival and reproduction and social influence, is not up to the task of grasping the truths of the universe. All the more reason why there has to be a community of thinkers and a set of rules that circumvents all of the biases that we would naturally fall back on. Rules like you can criticize anyone's ideas, no matter how upsetting the criticism might be to those who hold the ideas. Like you have to justify your beliefs through consistency with other beliefs or through empirical evidence. That a community of thinkers and a set of rules that penalizes error and that rewards truth is our only hope to collectively getting closer and closer to the truth, given that no one of our brains in isolation has been designed for that task.
I think Steve makes a really interesting point about the idea of for want of a better phrase, you might call public reason or publicly shared reasoning. Science, for example, is a great collective enterprise and a self-correcting one. The scientists are always keen to show that other scientists are wrong about something, And that's very good because they subject other people's work to scrutiny. And it's the use of the technique of proof, not in the formal sense in logic or mathematics where you can derive a conclusion from premises deductively, but in the sense of testing, always looking for the best evidence to support or to infirm something, to show that something is incorrect. And it's that constantly subjecting things to test which provides that kind of corrective to the great collective process of inquiry.
Also, if I can add something, there are quirks of human psychology, including our emotional psychology, that stand in the way of our approaching the truth, such as the natural merging of one's beliefs with one's sense of worth. And it's true that when someone challenges one of my beliefs, if someone claims to show a flaw in one of my arguments, I can feel the blood rush to my face. I can feel a little bit of anger. I can imagine that in some other era, if I had the power, I could have them put away for the intolerable affront of challenging my idea. So I recognize that impulse, and so I'm not shocked when there are fatwas against Salman Rushdie. I might impose my own fatwas against people who disagree with me. But it's precisely because I think as a psychologist, and at the same time I can step outside myself and realize that that reaction is itself irrational, itself will lead to great harm if indulged, that I'm better off, and we're all better off, if we submit to a rule system that says that no matter how insulted you are when your ideas are challenged, you can't act on that. You don't have any right not to be offended. You don't have any right not to be insulted. You don't have any right for your beliefs not to be challenged, because you could be, indeed, you probably are wrong. And so it's good if other people have the freedom to point that out.
Could you really believe that Steve would ever want to impose a fatwa? He's making it up.
I'm told the last question. There's one. We'll come back to you. Please.
Professor Grayling, I wanted to ask you what the concept of eudaimonia and the good life that you keep talking about in your books mean before the Enlightenment.
Well, it always, actually, it may very well be that since the Enlightenment, because of the recognition and acceptance of a very wide range of values that people could pursue, that people did begin to lose a little bit of the sense of what eudaimonia meant. We now talk about happiness and the pursuit of happiness, not quite in the way that the founding fathers of the United States meant it, because, you know, we mean it rather in the sense that if we were to pour Prozac into the public water supply, we would all be happy and we wouldn't mind what. But of course, Aristotle meant something very much richer and deeper than that. He meant something much more like a sense of well-being and well-doing, of sort of positive movement. We have here an authority in the audience, Professor Richard Sarabji, who will give you a very neat disposition on the concept of eudaimonia. But it's much more that. It is something which respects the insight that we all of us learn, that if you think happiness is mere pleasure or not having to go to work or having enough money, that soon runs out of steam, and it's not a very important notion. And the kind of meaning that we attach to the word happiness now is such that if we were to actively pursue it, that would be the very best way to be unhappy. Really, eudaimonia is something else. It comes with a rich effort to try to be and to do something deeply worthwhile.
Gentleman with the hat.
Thanks for taking my my question. Very intrigued, to listen to this discussion today, because it's titled "The Defense of the Enlightenment," and we've spoken a lot about the rational mind, and Mr. Pinker has just spoken about how what actually makes his blood boil is when someone challenges your beliefs. And later you made a statement.
He didn't mean it, though.
No, which spoke about your ideas, but he did. Because actually, I am surprised that we are talking about enlightenment as something which is to be thought out by the rational mind, and not something which is realized. Throughout time, whatever literature is about enlightenment talks about realization. There's no mention of heart. There's only been mention of mind here, in this discussion. Your belief is from your heart. If I ask you why did you fall in love with your wife, It's not your mind, but it's your heart. Everything cannot be explained by the rational mind, and if we try and explain enlightenment using the rational mind, maybe that is an impediment to enlightenment and the attainment of enlightenment in the first place. It's heart.
Okay, two quick things on that. I don't think either of us, certainly I don't think that the emotions, and particularly the emotion of love, is not important. On the contrary, as I said earlier, I think it may be the most important thing about us. But in order to get really clear on this idea of enlightenment, we must go back to the great Immanuel Kant, who wrote an essay in the 18th century entitled, "What is Enlightenment?" And he said, we don't live in an enlightened age, but we live in an age when it's getting more enlightenment, the light is dawning. Enlightenment means it's a process of clearer understanding and more knowledge. And in fact, when we, I think, still talk about the Enlightenment Project now, we talk about the diffusion of understanding of a wider grasp of the nature of things, of ourselves and our world. We don't claim to have got the truth. Voltaire said quite rightly, I love the man who seeks the truth and I hate the one who claims that he's got it. And that actually really sums it up. It's the process, it's the journey towards more understanding, better knowledge, more responsible use of what we know, more responsible and caring relationships with other people. That is that process which enlightenment is.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your coming here straight from the airport. You must be dying for a cup of tea. I think you still have...
I'm still flying, actually.
You still have signings to do, I believe, so people should get their books if they want from the